Hello, thank you very much. Happy to be back here again at the Cote-Saint-Luc Library. A great pleasure to see you all again, and I do thank you for coming. What brought me here this year, different from last year, is the whole question of what has suddenly become a primary question in our daily conversations. The topic of the day is tariffs. But before I do that, I better tell you who I am. I'm a retired adjunct, adjunct prop from the University of Ottawa, and I was in the Department of Communication for 20 odd years there. And a great pleasure it was to be there all those years and dealing with the contemporary questions of how do we communicate? How do we reach other people? And most important of all, can we teach things that are true that help people understand where they are here and now? So that's what led me to choose this topic today, tariffs and whether Canada should join the United States. Now, the question, of course, has been around for a very long time. Our talk hopes to confirm that history, my belief anyway, does not repeat itself, but historical patterns do. So I thought it best to conduct a kind of historical hopscotch to provide us with a means to try to answer that satisfies all the contemporary Canadian anxieties about where's all this going to end anyway. So, as history itself might say, in a national tug of war struggle, and that's what we see going on now, neither side ever wins permanently, at least, but the coolest and most rational heads ultimately prevail. And that's what I'm going to try to show today as I give you historical examples of the question. Now, as an example, how does how do images communicate themselves to you? If you notice my opening slide, well, yes, there's an elephant. Did you notice the guy asleep on the right-hand side? Sleeping with an elephant? Who could that possibly be? Ah, I get it. There we are, the way of kind of using a form of, poetry to deal with the whole question of what's what. So, as far as all that goes, I thought it'd be best to start out with Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in March of 1969. And he was speaking at Washington, D.C. Press Club. And this is what he said. I'm not going to run it because it's kind of garbly. And on top of all of that, well, it's more interesting to watch the way he does it. Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even tempered is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt. The audience laughed nervously. His son, Canada's most recently retired prime minister, put it more simply: we are Canadians because we're not Americans. I think that's a bit of a too simple reply. I thought, well, try this for a response. How about we're here because we're here? Yes, why ask the question of what are Canadians? We're here. That's it. Recognize that. At any rate, let's try a little bit of history to show how this long, long process of identification has gone on. The American Continental Congress wrote to Quebec on the eve of the Revolutionary War in 1774, quote, Canada may count the union of 13 colonies as unalterable friends rather than inveterate enemies, end quote. Quebec ignored their invitation to join. Some months later, the Continental Congress tried again. Quote, British rule has reduced Canadians to slavery and endangered their religious freedom, end quote. Again, no reply from the Canadians. Quiet bunch they were. George Washington appealed in August of 1775. This is just as the revolution is getting going. Quote, let us run together to the same goal to drive the British out of North America. Silence. Congress then authorized an invasion of Canada. George Washington wrote to inform Canadians that Benedict Arnold was heading their way with a detachment. Come then, my brethren, unite with us in an indissoluble union, and let us together run to the same goal. More silence. 2 years later, the Americans pre-approved the admission of the province of Quebec, which is nothing like the province that we have today. All of Canada at that time, except for Prince Rupert's Land, was considered the province of Quebec. Admission of the province of Quebec to the United States. Again, no answer. Silent but polite Canadians they all were, indicating a certain national characteristic. At any rate, American rebel forces occupied Montreal easily in November of 1775 under General Richard Montgomery. The outnumbered British troops abandoned the Montreal garrison. Montgomery's troops were undisciplined, underdressed, and basically unfit for duty. In Montreal, they lacked provisions and offered to pay with paper money, the continental dollar. But the dollar had depreciated to worthlessness. French Canadian farmers would accept only hard currency. Montreal gave Montgomery the cold shoulder, and he left a disappointed man. Not welcome exactly, would we say. Montgomery's troops then rode down the St. Lawrence River. Remember, the St. Lawrence runs down toward the sea, to Quebec City to join their ally, Colonel Benedict Arnold, who had come up through Maine to join them and try and get the prize of prizes. Now, Colonel Benedict Arnold had trudged through Maine's wilderness to meet Montgomery at Quebec. He and his rebel soldiers suffered terribly. Short of provisions and gunpowder, they waded through Maine's swamps with inaccurate maps and leaky boats. November, cold month. Arnold lost half his men from smallpox and desertion. The remaining 500 were so starved that they had to boil their cartridge belts and then ate Colonel Arnold's pet dog, including its entrails. They arrived at Quebec in late December, hardly ready to do battle. You see, what's their object? This is it. Take Quebec's 100-meter-high citadel overlooking St. Lawrence River. It was called the Gibraltar of North America, the gateway to the continent's interior. Its cannons, you see, determined what ships could come and go. If the rebel Americans captured Quebec, they hoped to stop British armed forces and their movements and expel them from the continent. So Quebec was going to be the hinge of the American Revolution if the Americans could seize it. And that's what this particular series of events is all about. So fierce winter street fighting shattered Arnold's column at the Battle of Quebec, December 31st, 1775. In a blinding snowstorm, Arnold never made it past Old Town in Quebec, and the citadel remained untouched. But why attack in a snowstorm? His soldiers were mostly farmers whose enlistment contracts were due to expire midnight, December 31st, that very night. And so Canadian weather was the general that saved the day. The entire campaign was a failure. On top of that, General Montgomery was killed and a bullet hit Arnold's ankle. The battle was over and lost. Old Town barricades stopped Arnold and the citadel stayed British. Back at Fort Ticonderoga, the depressed Arnold resented not receiving higher promotion for all his trouble and pain. I think it was mainly, I read in close detail about that trek through the state of Maine, after which he gets nothing but aggravation. I think that had a lot to do with what he decided to do. He conspired to hand Fort Ticonderoga over to the British, but the plan was discovered. He defected, and his name forever became synonymous with treason. It all depends how you look at it, isn't it? So the revolution is on, and war propaganda is always important. For example,
stuff a feather in his cap and called it pepperoni. Yankee Doodle, beat it up. Yankee Doodle, find the music and the step and let the girls be handy.
Well, there you have the famous Yankee Doodle song, which became a kind of a chant during the war. And I thought you'd like to know the history of Yankee Doodle. It's actually a British drinking song, and it mocked the Americans as weak and gay. The British referred to the American enemy as both a doodle, a country hick and a dandy, and a conceited jerk. The Macaroni Club in Britain was known for its homosexual membership and named after the racy new noodle from Italy called the macaroni. The British sang the Yankees had no horses, so they could only ride ponies. So you see, they were making a lot of fun of the new enemy. And here's a poster from the period showing the Yankee Doodle Dandy. I find it quite ironic to see that it ultimately becomes a song that unites Americans rather than separates them. At any rate, the Yankee Doodles won their independence by 1783, and I can't go through the whole litany of how a revolution was won, but 4 colonies now comprise British North America: Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. And if you look at the map closely, it's not a traditional map, but it shows you those areas. And the United States western borders stopped at the Appalachian Mountains. The British were bitter and inconsolable, and they promised revenge. So what happens is that President Thomas Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in 1803. Napoleon sold the entire territory for $15 million just to aggravate the British. He knew that France wasn't making any money on it, but anything to aggravate the British and prevent them from claiming the central part of the new America. This is the Louisiana Purchase, a very important real estate deal to say the least, because Jefferson doubles the United States territory and assumes the right to obtain Indian lands by treaty or by conquest. And he began serious United States expansionism and a very long-term intention to occupy the whole North American continent. And what you see here is a hint of what will be coming then through the 19th century. American expansionism is absolutely essential for their benefit, not for anyone else's. And the dark brownish color you see on the right is the new United States, and then you find the spaces in between identified accordingly. I'm not going to get into it, but you can see this continent needs to be consumed. The only thing that's not covered at all is the fact that above the American claims, Prince Rupert Land and Canada remain empty because they belong to Great Britain, who's not about to give them up or sell them at all. So the British are unreconciled due to over losing their 13 colonies. And they seize American and British sailors in the early 1800s to fight their war with France, which is going on in the early 1800s. President Jefferson tries and fails to use tariffs to hurt Great Britain at this time, and he closes the American economy by outlawing trade between America and any foreign port. This was his way of using tariffs. In other words, to say, you can't trade with us at all. The tariffs that he did try to levy outraged both Britain and the United States businessmen, and recession followed. An important historical note to keep in mind. By 1812, this aggravation, this constant aggravation, will lead ultimately to war. And in America's Congress, many so-called war hawks wanted war with Britain. Senator Samuel Smith crows in 1812, "We have the Canadas as much as our command as Great Britain has the ocean. I'm not for stopping at Quebec or anywhere else, but I would take the whole continent from them and ask no favors. I wish never to see peace until we do." You see, the war hawks of the United States assumed that the loyalists who had left America for British North America, having fled to Canada during the Revolution, would naturally be in favor of United States annexation of British North America. Guess what? They were wrong. Ex-President Thomas Jefferson joins the chorus of U.S. nationalism, and he says, "The acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching. But you see, the United States failed in the War of 1812. First, the British troops in Canada were very well trained. And second, the United States never thought so many former Americans, that is, the Loyalists, would join the Canadian militia and fight to defend their new home ground. Hint, people like to defend their home and hearth. The War of 1812 then becomes President Madison's War, a conflict of disaster, humiliation, and near bankruptcy for the United States. There's poor Madison, a forgotten figure by now, for sure. And this event occurs in what will become Toronto. 750 British soldiers, Canadian militiamen, and Indigenous allies will lose Toronto, called York, to 2,700 invading Americans in April of 1813. The war's been going on for a year, and here come the Yankees, and it was thought that, well, they'll join us. The former loyalists, they'll join us. We are all Americans. And what happens is that the American troops from Kentucky find a scalp in the Legislative Assembly that they thought belonged to a deceased American soldier. The scalp was actually the speaker's wig. The clueless and ruthless Kentuckians looted and burned public buildings and then withdrew. York belonged to them, but all that's belonged to them is the embers of the public buildings. Now, understand this that follows is that August 24th, 1814, a year later, British troops occupy Washington in revenge. 26 hours worth. August 24th, 1814, they burn public buildings and they leave private property alone. It was not the usual business of troops going wild. They burned the public buildings of Washington to show, you burned our buildings in York, we will burn your buildings in Washington. And so Washington's public buildings went up in smoke, and you see here the executive mansion. We also have the executive mansion, what's left of it here, would be rebuilt to become the White House. Here's an example. Or the British also set fire to Washington's unfinished Capitol. Of course, you wouldn't recognize it because there's no dome yet, but that's the legislature, and that goes up in smoke as well. Well, it was a disaster, to say the least, this War of 1812, and Americans never forgot what happened when the British burned Washington. But I wanted to give you the prelude to that, which was that, well, you burned ours, we burned yours. I'm not saying who was right. I'm simply saying it's often forgotten in American explanation for this period of time, what happened when. Now, Francis Scott Key witnessed the British bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, just across the river from Washington. And the British failure to take Fort McHenry inspired the poet-lawyer Francis Scott Key to write lyrics to a popular British drinking song about celebrating wine and good times. Francis Scott Key gave this virtually unsingable song new lyrics and a permanent life as a soon-to-be immortal national anthem. Some called this the only real American victory in the War of 1812 that otherwise ended in stalemate. Well, Francis Scott Key probably was a better lawyer than he was lyrics writer, but there you have it, America's national anthem born from the War of 1812. And so an expansionist United States then sees itself as having to occupy the whole continent. And the part that you see on this map, which is in kind of light tan, that's British America. That stays British America. British troops are here to defend British America, but all the rest is up for grabs. And from 1846 to 1848, what you see on this map is how the United States took this territory, various pieces of territory, from the Spanish, who controlled the rest of continental, what will become the United States. British North America was very costly to protect, and Britain hoped to avoid war because it had other trouble at home. But here it is, wondering, what is the future going to bring? What the future is going to bring for poor Great Britain, I shouldn't say poor Great Britain, but they got themselves into their own mess because they had passed what's called the Corn Laws. from 1815. So that's as the War of 1812 ended. The British passed Corn Laws, which basically protect Britain's landowning class, the aristocrats, to be able to sell their crops at a higher price than anywhere else. What that means is that the conservatives in Great Britain used tariffs to guarantee their wealth. Tariffs forced the new class of industrially employed workers and the whole middle class to bear the financial burden, while landowners enjoyed agrarian life. Everything that they raised was sold for sky-high prices. The conservatives argued tariffs were needed to raise government revenue. Well, of course, it makes sense, doesn't it? Well, not if you're having to pay such high prices for bread. And this is what leads to bread riots from 1815 on, off and on, and the need to end these onerous duties, onerous tariffs on food products. So I wanted to mention that because you've got a 21% tariff on wheat, barley, and oats that made the cost of living really a struggle for workers and the middle classes. Something had to change. And so what helps make things change is the Irish potato famine in 1845 to 52, 7 years of terrible crop failure, a human disaster that helped speed the end to tariffs altogether in Britain. And you see how tariffs kind of sneak in under the curtain with respect to, well, what do they mean anyway? 1 million Irishmen die of starvation during this period of time. Starvation and disease. And the British government says, we can't do anything to help because the land is owned by the aristocracy and the aristocracy is us. Well, that of course is the way it is. The main issue for Britain, how to ease Englishmen's high cost of food, which was affecting 90% of the population. They couldn't take the high prices for bread. It was just too expensive, and subsistence was an insult to the majority. And so what happens? Well, you see the memorial in the middle of this picture, and to the far right, 100,000 Irish migrated to Canada. That's how we got the first large bulge of Irishmen coming to Canada. Finally, the tariffs will end in 1846, and lower food costs improve the welfare of Britain's citizen consumers. And what we see here are the new factories on the left and the account for what it was like to be living during this time. If you can't remember reading it as a high school student, I call your attention to Charles Dickens' Hard Times, which recreates the terrible suffering that people went through during this period of time. Finally, the tariffs are ended. What does that mean? The price of bread is down. If the price of bread is down, what does this mean? Factory owners can now pay the new British industrial class lower wages. And that is part of what it all brings about. British tariffs then had tempted the United States to offer Canada flowery promises. And this is a poster from the era, which shows Uncle Sam on the left, his coattail being pulled by, well, probably a fat American businessman. Flirtation under difficulties. Uncle Sam is offering Canada this bouquet, and here's Canada off to the right being held back by a British subject and reaching out to say, well, free flowers, I think I might take them. Struggling Canadian manufacturers wanted protective tariffs for themselves to help infant industry in Canada supply goods to Canadian consumers. So Canada wanted protective tariffs for its reason. Yet many American manufacturers favored selling their goods to Canada duty-free. You understand why. And Canadian farmers wanted to sell grain, cattle, and lumber duty-free to the United States, while the United States farmers near the border said, well, there's no reason at all to let the Canadians compete with us. The slave-holding South favored tariffs to avoid annexation of slave-free Canada into the United States. They don't want to see Canada become an independent entity, and the last thing they want to see is a place which is free of slavery. So you see how the cards are all piling up here. Montreal businessmen demand by 1849. And I know I'm jumping ahead, but I'm choosing these historical examples so you can see the way that things wave back and forth. On the left, if you hadn't figured it out, that's Canada, and being coaxed on to face the giant on the right. You know who that is. And with British help, Canada is saying, we need to have some kind of help. We want free trade. Reciprocity is what they called it in the 19th century. And if we can't get free trade, then we want annexation to the United States. This is something that happens in 1849. The treaty allows free transit, and they do get a treaty by the middle of that decade, 1854, a treaty allowing free transit of Canadian grains and natural products into the U.S. Canada becomes accustomed to the pleasures of having no duty on your natural products. And so it looks as though things are going very much in Canada's way, one would hope anyway. And then we have to look at another side of the economic coin. The United States riverboats had been transporting southern cotton to Great Britain from the early 1800s. Look at here's a typical riverboat filled with bales of cotton. A typical bale, by the way, weighs 470 pounds, 300 kilos, and is worth $329 in 19th century dollars. By the way, a 19th century dollar is what you got for a day's pay, $1 a day for pay. So if a bale of cotton is worth $329, you can see how valuable the cotton trade is to Great Britain. And so Britain is benefiting from the importation of southern cotton. Oh, the question that it's all being handled and raised by slaves made no difference to Great Britain. They're talking about economics. And so cotton is first and foremost essential to keep Britain's textile mills and hundreds of thousands of people working to produce cloth for the world. There was one main producer of cloth for the world, that was Great Britain. And that's what they wanted to keep. So with the coming of the American Civil War in 1861, Britain sells arms to the Confederate States of America in exchange for Southern cotton. That's why Great Britain had no problem at all trading with the, very cantankerous Southern states, the Confederate States of America. War with the Union was a danger for Great Britain. The Americans, the Union, did not like the fact that Britain is trading with our enemy. But this does not deprive the South of the means to wage war. What happens, and this shows you in the two pictures that I've included here, on the left, we've got a British steel foundry that's producing steel that ultimately ends up as Enfield rifles on the right, and the rifles are sold to the Confederacy, and they are fighting against the Union. You understand why Canada has the reputation for being pro-South. Not that they're pro-South as much as this is all part of a trading network. The Union blockaded Southern cotton. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston said, "We proclaim neutrality in Great Britain. Britain refuses to recognize the Confederate States of America as a legal entity, yet to recognize the South as a belligerent is acceptable in international law." Britain's main concern was to keep the textile industry working. We have to keep that as what's going on in the background. You see, the cotton-starved British Midlands had become idle as 600,000 textile workers are unemployed in Great Britain. And the question is, how do we get these men back to work? We have to get cotton, and once we have cotton, we'll put them back to work, we'll produce cloth for the world, and we'll remain the greatest power in the world. Britain started developing new sources of cotton during the American Civil War, both in India, in Egypt, and in Brazil. To use the quotation of the year, cotton is king. And here you see an example of it in a contemporary cartoon. In November 1861, an eager Union captain seizes two Confederate diplomats from the British steamer Trent. This escapade was unauthorized and illegal, but the issue was how both the United States and Britain could extract themselves from this embarrassment without losing face. Once you seize the diplomats who are your enemies, no one will let them go, because if you let them go, it's going to look as though you're weak. So this is the problem that develops with the seizure of these diplomats. The British media responded angrily. Anticipate war with the United States, the media almost universally said. And British Foreign Minister Lord Russell sent an ultimatum to the United States. There will be war if the diplomats aboard the Trent, the ship on which the diplomats were riding, are not released along with an American apology. Well, that's asking for a lot too, isn't it? Nobody authorized the raid, but once it happened, how to get out of it? And this is one of the odd things about history. You can stumble into a confrontation, but it sure is hard to get out of it. Because what happens is that the Union had purchased 2,000 tons of saltpeter to make bullets. Britain stopped the shipment. It was sitting in Liverpool. And for the Americans, for the Union, well, where's our saltpeter? We paid for it. We see examples of saltpeter on the left here, and that's what was used in the 19th century to make bullets. Well, Britain then, in order to avoid looking weak itself, orders 8,000 troops to sail to Canada's defense. Get on the ships, boys. You've got to reach the St. Lawrence before the river freezes over. And the British ambassador adds to the American foreign diplomats, we hope you'll take this in proper spirit, but 100 officers need to follow the troops. Well, 100 officers following. Meanwhile, Washington is wondering, how the heck do we get out of this problem? Our guy seized these diplomats illegally, but we can't admit that this is all illegal. So the President Lincoln and his cabinet are shown here meeting Christmas Eve, 1861, to discuss the illegal seizure of the Southern diplomats. Lincoln sits silently as Secretary of State Seward, that's to the right of center. You see a guy with a beard there. Go to the right of him, a seated gentleman. That's William Seward. Explains, gentlemen, the whole thing was a mistake. It is illegal, we admit, but how do we get out of it? Once the diplomats are released, the saltpeter is released. Mr. President, what do we do? Well, I will quote you, Mr. President, saying, quote, when you hold an elephant by the tail, you let him run, end quote. Lincoln smiled at Seward and ended the cabinet meeting with one comment. There'll be no war unless England is bent upon having one. While the United States did not need two wars at one time, it's fighting the Civil War. And so this particular event shows us how tricky it is to be involved in international diplomacy. And so to avoid hostility, Secretary of State Seward offers to let the Canadian Railway, called the Grand Trunk, carry the British officers through United States territory. What I have on the right-hand side is a picture of the Canadian Railway at the time, the Grand Trunk. The red dot is where it ends. In other words, it ends in the middle of nowhere, Rivière-du-Loup, but there's no way to get to the Maritimes. The Grand Trunk runs through the states of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. That's the way it was built. And now the question is, are we going to let the British officers who are following the troops cross the United States to perhaps confront us in a violent confrontation? Seward has his answer as usual. Cigar in hand, he hurries over to meet the Canadian representative, the British representative, in an exchange that goes something like this. I don't have the exact words, but from what I've read, it looks like this. So, Lord Lyons, How about in the customary act of friendship, we offer to let the British transport the officers, their baggage, military stores, arms, ammunition, whatever the troops had left over, across Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. What do you think of that, huh? Well, Lord Lyons is shocked, but quickly accepts the offer. Lord Russell tells the British cabinet, we can't believe what's happened, but they're letting our officers cross American territory to prepare to fight them. Well, they've also said, forget about demanding the apology from the Union. They're not going to apologize. Let's forget the whole bloody thing. And they do. War is avoided again. Isn't it easy to avoid war if both sides are convinced we don't need it, we don't want it? Why? Because Britain and the Union had escaped a mutually unwanted war. People are starving in Great Britain. All the machinery is not working. They're not producing cloth. There's no cotton. And Canada, for its part, hopes that the Confederacy will win so that the disunited States of America would result in two weak powers that would threaten neither Canada nor Britain. So the Canadian position during the American Civil War is, we hope the South wins. Because if they win, that's the end of the United States. Politics, huh? So the South knew that the Civil War was lost by the fall of 1864. And what we see here is a picture of American officers. U.S. Grant is in the middle of all of that, if I'm not mistaken. General Sheridan is the general in the middle of all of this. And September 1864, nothing left of Atlanta, Georgia. And so there is Confederate desperation. They are losing the war. How do we manage to put an end to the disaster that has befallen us in the South? Now, a footnote. I stopped myself. I digress because I couldn't let this pass up. A frustrated actor appears in Montreal in October of 1864, and he stays at a fancy hotel in Old Montreal for 10 days. There's the hotel, and he likely hatched or discussed an abduction plot in the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel lobby. His plot is to kidnap President Lincoln and hold him as a hostage and get all the prisoners that are in American concentration camps holding Confederate officers and men and say, you can have your president back if you release all our men. That's the plot. And he's talking about it here in Montreal, in this very place that you see here. John Wilkes Booth is his name. Hungry for immortality. And after too much drink, he allegedly let slip that Lincoln's time is up. He assassinates Lincoln 7 months later. The plot to kill Lincoln, then, was not a plot to kill him, but a plot to abduct him. The actual plan to kill him will occur when the abduction plan falls apart in the early months of 1865. But it's a really interesting period of time to study if you're interested in knowing how does it work that things happen in history that are unplanned and cause cataclysmic results. Meanwhile, our guy in Old Montreal, bragging about Lincoln's time being up, is unaware that at the same place, same time, there are Confederate raiders who've come into town and have left town on horseback, and they've gone to attack St. Albans, Vermont from Montreal. And they didn't know about Booth's plans. That we're 99% sure of. This, by the way, is St. Albans, Vermont. Not today. They've paved the streets today. But it's a very quiet and lyrical New England town, to say the least. The raiders cross the border, rob 3 St. Albans banks, and flee back to Canada. It's interesting just to be able to see, here in the bank, here's one of the banks. Here's one of the leaders, Confederate leaders, Lieutenant Bennett Young, who led the raid. And what they were doing in robbing the banks was to show that the South could continue fighting in guerrilla actions. Southern terrorists chose St. Albans because it is so close to the Canadian border. We'll rob the banks and run across the border. Here's the Franklin County Bank in downtown St. Albans. I stuck a red dot above the bank so you could see where it was at the time. Again, these are contemporary photographs, so I just thought from history's point of view, you'd find this interesting to see. And again, they've paved the main street, yes. So that bank is robbed. A Confederate Army captain tells a terrified bank to hand over $78,000, sir. The captain grabs the teller, and two soldiers put the revolvers to the teller's head, as you see here. And the teller says, please, don't shoot. I have a wife and children. Spare me, I beg of you. Sir, we are Confederate soldiers. We have come to rob the banks and burn your town, and we are going to do it. Franklin County Bank yields him $78,000. The quotations, by the way, are from the court case that followed, so I didn't make this up. This comes from the court transcript, which is a fascinating thing to read if ever you're into that type of history. So other raiders take $55,000 at the First National Bank, and one raider points to a teller's head, sir, if you offer any resistance, I will shoot you dead. You are our prisoner. And needless to say, no resistance at all. However, what does happen is that there's someone who does say, I don't want to go along with this stuff. And gunfire breaks out outside one of the banks, terror, and a heist of $208,000. A bystander is shot and dies. And so a few of the townspeople arrive and begin firing. It's absolute pandemonium going on. But they take off for the border, and off they go, running so fast that the dollar bills are falling out of their saddlebags as they're rushing to get across the line. Union General Dix orders the Vermonters, pursue the raiders into Canada and destroy them. President Lincoln, on hearing this, says, no, 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 no. This will spark a war with Britain, which both the Confederacy and Canada would actually hope for. We cannot allow this to happen. The Confederacy wants international recognition. Canada would benefit from the U.S. becoming two weak nations rather than a strong one. Lincoln, in his wisdom, said, no, I can't allow them to chase. But it's too late. 20 Vermont volunteers are already galloping after the raiders toward Canada, and the trail of spilled dollars was very easy for them to follow. The Vermonters cross the border, enter Stanbridge, Quebec, and they arrest the raiders while they're in bed and bring them out and say, you are our prisoners. We are taking you back across the line. Guess who shows up? British redcoats on the Canadian side. Stop the Vermonters, unhold those gentlemen, and we insist you are in the Queen's territory. We are under Queen's law. You will not take those individuals across the border. They will face justice here in British America, and with justice being disposed of, they will then be released to you to take across the border. Well, they didn't have any choice, did they? They didn't want to spark a war. So the Vermonters turn over the prisoners to the British, as we see here. And they jail the men here in Montreal, waiting comfortably in prison, and some of them are even posing for the camera. There's a huge haul of money is sitting right next to them virtually. And who's going to defend them? Oh, there's a brilliant lawyer. His name is John Abbott. You may have heard his name once or twice. Well, they're feasting on food and wine and even attracting some curious women who want to know what's all the fuss about. President Lincoln is shocked to learn the outcome. John Abbott says, now see here, there is no treaty, there is no extradition treaty between British America and the United States. The court has no jurisdiction over these men. You have to let them go. And the judge, Judge Cursall, who's no friend of the British, says, oh, all right. And he lets the men go with their money. And they're gone. Can you believe it? Washington learns about this, and they can't believe what has happened. the men had been released with their stolen money, and the Secretary of State, Seward, says, oh, that's it. I can't take this anymore. The 10-year U.S.-Canada Reciprocity Treaty, the no tariff treaty, is now non-renewable. It expires in 1864, and it's done. And on top of that, passports for anyone crossing from Canada. First time in Canadian history, passports are demanded of Canadians crossing the American line. Seward had, of course, long wanted Canada to join the U.S. And the reason why? Quote, well, because it's there, there's no further argument, end quote. In 1853, he had said, if we will not allow Canada to come near, at least she can never be an adversary. So he's hoping Canada will somehow join America. Now, Great Britain, let's get back to the British, have been encouraging the creation of a Canadian Confederation for defensive and economic reasons since 1860, because the cost of defending Canada is a financial burden to Britain. And they thought, well, an autonomous Canada would no longer be a British prize if war would break out between Britain and the United States. And so the hope is, let's turn Canada over to itself. Let's make it an autonomous country. Hence, the move toward Canadian Confederation comes directly from the top, from Great Britain, which says, we don't need them anymore. Let them become autonomous and defend themselves. John A. Macdonald, a name you've heard once or twice, George Etienne Cartier, another, planned to achieve the Canadian Confederation because Great Britain says, do it. And so Macdonald says, I have a promise to English Canada, autonomy and loyalty to the Queen. As far as Cartier's position, well, you have the state or the United States. Which one are you going to have? Huh? You must choose one or the other. And that's how Quebec came into Confederation. Cartier was a real hero for a lot of people, according to that rendition. And so they meet at Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. You're all aware of that conference, September 64, uniting New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Upper Canada, Lower Canada, all together, 4 provinces. And there we have it, the Fathers of Confederation all enjoying the fact we are going to have a united entity. We are going to have a country which we haven't decided what to call it yet, but we'll think of something. At any rate, Queen Victoria signs the British North America Act in 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada. But I wanted the Kingdom of Canada, says Macdonald. Are you kidding? You're going to insult the Americans and they'll attack us. We'll call it Dominion, sir. Oh, all right, Dominion it is. And that's how kingdom disappears from the language. There's Queen Victoria, who's given her positive approval to all of this. And for our own historical sake, the British North America Act of 1867, I'm going to give it to you from a negative point of view. First, positive, peace, order, and good government. Anyone ever asks you, what makes you different from America? Those 3 words, folks, absolutely central to who Canadians are. Not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not we hold these truths to be self-evident. No, Canada is born as a counter-revolutionary country. No revolution here, folks. This is what makes Canada absolutely unique. There's no blood being shed as this country comes into existence. And so reciprocity is gone. The Americans, Seward has said, oh, to hell with them. He swore a lot, so I'll just use those words. Yeah, to hell with them anyway. The Americans are hoping that the Canadians will now agree to join the United States now that they're independent. And in this poster, which I found absolutely stunning, Mrs. Britannia, she's the one in the middle, says to her daughter on the far left, is it possible, my dear, that you've given your cousin Jonathan any encouragement? End quote. Answer by Miss Canada. Encouragement, certainly not, Mama. I have told him we can never be united. Never be united. And Uncle Sam just puffing away on his cigar. I got time. I got time. So McDonald and the Conservatives now want to stay in power. Why not? That's what politicians do. And they dither over two Canadian choices. Should we try to get free trade established once again as it was from 1853 to, sorry, 1853 to 64? Or do we try to uh, somehow get a kind of way of staying in power where we institute tariffs? Yeah, let us introduce tariffs. So this is the Canadian dilemma right after Confederation occurs. Which should we choose? Which would be best for the country? And I brought up in closer detail, here's John A. Macdonald trying to decide, well, on the one hand, on the other. And everyone's wondering, how is the old master going to do? The impatient Canadian press says, well, whither are we drifting? McDonald says, okay, ultimately, we'll do tariffs. Canada chooses tariffs and Canadian nationalism. And look at that poster on the right. Isn't that a winner for an election? Absolutely, unbelievably strong. McDonald says, quote, my course is clear. A British subject I was born, and a British subject I will die. His strategy is high tariffs on imported goods to Canada and a promise to build a transcontinental railway as well as to fill the West with immigration. That's the Canadian policy. And MacDonald calls the protectionist tariff in 1878 national policy. And from 14% in 1877 up to 21% in 1880. And the cartoons show us Uncle Sam being kicked out on the left, and on the right, well, MacDonald acting like a spoiled schoolboy, saying, but we want it this way, Great Britain. That's the way we want it. So Canada loves tariffs, something that we don't think of today in terms of what we're being faced with. And the Canadian federal election by 1911, Canada has been trying to get free trade. The Americans have said no. And guess what happens? In 1911, the Americans say, hey, President Taft, I've got something for you. A free trade treaty for you Canadians on all your natural products. But we have to protect American industries. How about it? Wilfrid Laurier, the liberal who's in opposition to the conservative John A. Macdonald, says, I like the idea of free trade because it brings the French Canadians and the English Canadians together to benefit economically. On the conservative side, John A. Macdonald is gone by now. Robert Borton, leading the Conservatives, says, now, wait a second. I'm not sure that I do not support it. Because what had happened is that Laurier got himself into trouble by quoting the Democrat Chap Clark, who made a speech in the Congress saying, quote, I look forward to the time when the American flag will fly over every square foot of British North America right up to the North Pole. The people of Canada are of our blood and language. It's great stuff for the Americans to hear. Not for the Canadians. It's a real loser. And this gives someone like Robert Borton the power to then say, no, we're going to stick with tariffs to protect ourselves and to protect the Conservative Party. And the tariffs stay. So that's how free trade does not come to Canada once the Americans offer it. And we'll go back and forth now. And I can't go back and forth, no time for that. But what I can do is to say, by the way, if you look at the 1930s, the Great Depression is crippling the world. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 worsens the world. And here you see the Republicans going one way and the other under the same blanket of the being part of the Republican elephant. They don't know what the heck they're doing. They raise import tariffs from 40 to 60%. And what it does is it disrupts and destroys international trade. Canada matches the United States tariffs with its own and suffers. And so the act, I should say, not a treaty, the act of Smoot-Hawley cripples the world for for the whole of the 1930s. Tariffs are here to stay. It would appear. How is it going to end to save all of that? Here comes World War II, and World War II changes everything. The United States and Canada start to unite as a single productive entity to fight against fascism and to destroy the Nazis who are trying to take over the world. So we find a country that's beset with tariffs, yet the result of 20th century Canadian tariffs. Anybody remember seeing this? You're probably too young. The Canadian built car of the 1950s. Canadian market only. Hey, that's a nice looking car. That's the 1956 Meteor Rito Victoria. And what is that car? Well, the frame is put on in the United States. They bring it across the line. And here in Canada, they stick on a grill, a little bit of trim on the sides, and white wall tires, and voila, a Canadian car. Well, it's a unique way of producing cars in Canada, and it's obvious the future cannot go that way. And that's why they'll start moving toward creating a united auto production, a united auto pact, which will occur in the 1980s. So you see how things kind of stumble along, and then the next thing we know, we're into something new. Take another example. In the 1890s, would the St. Lawrence Seaway help both America and the Canadians? In favor, a multinational waterway to the Great Lakes and an Ontario hydroelectric project. Very good. Against Quebec. Quebec says, no, you're going to end Montreal's dominance by building a seaway. We're opposed to it. And the fight goes on from the 1890s until the middle of the 1950s. And ultimately, the answer is we need hydroelectric power. It's going to come, and Canada pays for 2/3 of the seaway before the Americans go along.
The President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada and their wives leave for home.
President of the U.S. President of the U.S. and their wives say goodbye. This is the opening day of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And one of the things I thought would be worth mentioning as he's saying goodbye to the Queen is, by the way, don't you think it's a good idea for us to have you join the United States? The Queen was not amused. So as far as all that goes, now I'm jumping ahead to President Ronald Reagan's radio remarks against tariffs, April 1987.
That message of free trade is one I conveyed to Canada's leaders a few weeks ago, and it was warmly received there. Indeed, throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition.
Wow, that's pretty strong. Well, what can Premier Ford do about this? Let's take some of the pieces of that talk and let's hear it again as it played this past week.
When someone says that let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs.
Same thing.
And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. Over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead by foreign countries and the trade. Then the worst one. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industry shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. Throughout the world, the growing realization that the way to prosperity for all is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair competition. America's jobs and growth are at stake.
America's growth and jobs are at stake. We've got to reject tariffs and all that goes along with it. So Ford took a piece of that talk from 1985, plugged it in, and we're all familiar with what has happened. When the American president heard about this ad, He said, I've got nothing more to talk to your prime minister about. You're ripping us off, and that's the end of that. Well, we'll have to see how long that's going to go, but it's clear that you could use a lot of good propaganda based upon the American tradition, which is that you're better off with free trade than you are with tariffs. Why are they doing the tariffs? Well, Trump has announced that the U.S. will punish this country with an additional 10% tariff on goods. He's also suspended trade talks. And because of this ad, I would say that what happened over the last few days is not to be taken as being permanent policy. As it turns out, there are more words to be said with regard to the future. And so Prime Minister Carney wonders now, as we conclude our talk, how will the latest U.S. tariffs echo or contradict history? I tried to talk about how there are patterns that repeat themselves, but not history. And as such, the bilateral treaty that existed between ourselves, Mexico, and the United States is up for discussion and will disappear in 2036 unless it's replaced by something else in between. I'm sorry, the joint review of the free trade agreement is scheduled for July 1st this coming year. If the countries don't agree to extend it, the agreement will terminate in 2036. So what have we seen? Two historical elements have predominated relations since the 1700s. The U.S. desired to annex Canada and then both nations using tariffs for their own reasons. Canada to keep the country from U.S. annexation, and the United States to force Canada to pay for the privilege of being an independent neighbor and its largest trading partner. What will the future bring? Well, my job, fortunately, is to look at the past, not at the present or future, but we thought we'll just take a quick look from our balcony and have a look to see where is it all going? Is there a changing perspective? And what do you think should be the future? What does it mean for our people as a whole? Well, we do know that the patterns are repeating themselves, but which pattern do you think we should take? Are we like the helpless British who suffered decades of high prices caused by the Corn Laws? Or will new tariffs force the world into isolation and financial ruin? Which countries will beat a path to Washington and plead for forgiveness? Or will China give us a hint of the future, what they call a promise to fight tariffs to the end? I have no answer, but I'll open up the floor to your questions and we can do what we can to answer them. Thank you so much, folks. Would we be better off with tariffs? Without? Anyone from the audience? Questions? This is, yes, this is I think there's one word that can begin answering your excellent question. Why can't we be doing these kinds of things ourselves? I think the answer is one word: demographics. We have 39 million people. It's the economies of scale are such that it doesn't pay. And are the Americans going to buy, let's call our future car the Canuck? Are they going to buy the Canuck and not buy the big three product? This is the problem. Demographics. We don't have the market to be able to sell these cars and make a profit. And that leaves us constantly kind of what we first did in the 50s was, well, give us your car and we'll throw a grill on it and make it look different. Can't do it. You cannot actually produce a vehicle that is unique because the big three will bury you with their market 10 times larger than our own. It's not a very good answer, but that's the economic answer. You can't do it. So we can come up with terrific ideas as your examples describe, but we cannot get the economies of scale to produce. Who's going to invest in the Canuck car? Anybody want to put their lifetime savings into it? And that's the problem. It's true. That's right. But they're not going to try to build this is a great problem. Anyone coming here would have to be willing to give his life force, work, money, etc. And those who come do, and that's what makes immigration a very positive thing for the country, rather than a negative thing. We need to have more bodies in order to create a market that then can sustain itself. Many would argue that would be the answer to it. But your question is a very fair one, and it's frustrating to say we can't, yeah, we can't get it in 25 words or less. We can't get it. Another question, anyone? Did you? Yes, sir. Sir. It seems to me that the Swedish cars are sold in more than Sweden. They're sold all over Europe. And if you take the demographics of Europe as a whole, then the cars can be sold at an economically advantageous price for the producers and for the consumers. Again, it's the demographics, I think, sir. I think that's the reason why. You'd have to have something that is absolutely unique, that would become uniquely Canadian to survive in the cutthroat atmosphere that exists. And so what Canada has traditionally done, we talk about capital, what do Canadians do with their capital? They put it into Wall Street. Traditionally, that's where the money has gone. It goes to Wall Street to earn more money. And a certain percentage of it stays in Canada, a very large percentage leaves the country for investment, and the return on the investment is then used to build more money. It's not an easy answer, I know. And maybe the answer isn't we need a new car every 3 years. Maybe the answer is one car for a lifetime. Is that a possibility? What would happen if we decided to say one car per person per lifetime? Federal law. I wonder what would happen. It would certainly change things. It would change the consumer society tremendously. Maybe it needs considering, even though I'm being somewhat facetious. Yes. Why is our dollar going so low? Because our choices are very minimal. We do not have the choices that it would appear we should have. And we depend upon the American economy. If we were to break away from the American economy, what happens is you'll throw the entire balance of the economy into recession. If you try to, let's say, if you want to balance the Canadian dollar with the American dollar, which would be a great thing to do. $1.42 to buy an American dollar yesterday. What if we were able to buy an American dollar at par? What would happen? Well, I'm afraid we'd end up in a recession, and worse than that, a depression. Because the economies are united. And Trump knows that too, which is why the game that's being played now is not one that you necessarily should say, oh, heaven and earth are collapsing. Not so. They know what they depend on. They depend on Canada very strongly. It's just that they're playing a game. How long can we keep you spinning in the wind? And Carney, happily, is someone who doesn't take the bait. He's one of those Canadians who basically remains silent, if you notice how he responds to these kinds of provocations, and thinks positively and says, we will get there. It will take time. But unfortunately, 30 odd million people cannot successfully counter 300 million plus. It's just not possible. So I hope you found it somewhat enlightening to see that history is something that we tend to neglect when there's so much to be learned from it. And I've looked at just these few examples I've chosen, and there's much more detail that goes into them, which I have studied as an historian. But I just wanted to give you some ideas of how the history goes up and down like so. And we should be careful about jumping to conclusions, but also not to wring our hands and say, there's nothing we can do. We are a political entity as a country, and we are also very, very strong. We are strong without having to flex muscles. We've got them. We just know it. And we have to treat each other as fellow wrestlers who are wrestling against a very large body, which is what I showed you in that one example of the 19th century, the big guy coming at us. Anything else then? Well, thank you, folks. Oh, yes, one last person. All right, one last. The question is, how do we overcome the negativism that we're now facing on account of the flack that's coming from Washington? And I think the answer to that is to look historically at the way things have been. And that is, things go up, things go down. We have to be patient, as we were in the 1930s when there was massive unemployment. We had 20%, 25% unemployment. So to hold on, be careful, don't throw your money away, hold on to things and be optimistic that we can somehow face the rough tides ahead of us. But each of us can only do our part to say, but we're in it together and we have to act together as Canadians. And I think that is what strengthens us. When we responded to the American tariffs with, we're not going to take things sitting down, but we're going to wait and find our chance to improve the situation, we will, and we do. It just takes time. We're on the way down now, but remember, I'll do what the physicist always says. The physicist says, what goes up must come down. I work the other way around as an historian. What goes down must go up, and it will. Okay? Thank you, folks.